December 18th, 1944, in the Philippine Sea. Waves climb 60 feet high, the wind screams past 100 knots, and Admiral William F. Halsey's Third Fleet fights not Japan, but the Pacific itself. On USS New Jersey, crewmen on the bridge can't see the bow. Destroyers vanish in the mist. Aircraft snap their tie-downs and explode in carrier hangars. Within the hour, 3 destroyers will be gone, and nearly 800 sailors will vanish with them. This is the story of how the most powerful naval force of World War II sailed headfirst into a typhoon it never saw coming, and how the storm that followed changed the US Navy forever. In mid-December 1944, Admiral William Bull Halsey's US Third Fleet was operating in the Western Pacific as part of the Philippines campaign. Task Force 38, under Halsey's command, was a formidable armada: carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, conducting sustained air raids and covering General Douglas MacArthur's invasion. After weeks of fighting, many vessels were low on fuel and supplies, so Halsey ordered the fleet east to rendezvous with supply ships and replenish at sea, hoping to remain close to the action but out of range of land-based Japanese aircraft. At the time, wartime meteorology was primitive. Forecasts relied on limited reports from ships, islands, and occasional aircraft, with no satellites or computer models. Each carrier had an aerologist, and general forecasts came twice daily from Hawaii. Before the December 17th fueling, nothing alarming appeared in reports. Halsey's staff believed a disturbance was far to the east, but in reality, a compact tropical storm was already brewing dangerously close to the fleet. On December 17th, TF-38 attempted to refuel in worsening seas. Sailors struggled with heavy swells, hoses snapped, and destroyers like USS Maddox nearly collided with oilers. By noon, Halsey aborted the attempt and set a new rendezvous for the following morning, hoping for calmer waters. Unbeknownst to Halsey, his chosen haven lay directly in the path of the intensifying storm. The weather reports he relied on were dangerously inaccurate. In fact, Typhoon Cobra, as it would later be designated, was lurking only about 120 miles to the east of the fleet's current position. Captain Jasper Cuff, commanding the replenishment group, TG 30.8, became concerned that severe weather was moving toward the new refueling point, and warned that the next day's rendezvous might be overrun by the storm. Meanwhile, Fleet Weather Central in Hawaii plotted the disturbance as heading due north, missing the true westward track that would bring it right over Halsey's task force. Trusting the information at hand, but determined not to stray too far from supporting MacArthur's ongoing landings, Halsey unwittingly kept the Third Fleet on a collision course with the Typhoon. Over the late hours of December 17th, the seas continued to build. Halsey adjusted plans repeatedly as reports trickled in. Late that afternoon, upon learning of worsening weather near the second rendezvous, he ordered a new fallback rendezvous point, a third location, and steered the fleet due west, managing to outrun the storm for a brief time. Yet the reprieve was temporary. By nightfall, communications were patchy and confusion spread as the deteriorating weather forced ships to disperse over a wide area. With heavy swells battering his ships, Halsey cancelled the third rendezvous and designated a fourth one even further northwest. In an effort to use the wind direction to advantage, he ordered a course change from west to due south, planning to later swing northwest toward the new refueling point in the early morning hours. These zigzag maneuvers inadvertently kept the fleet crisscrossing in front of the oncoming typhoon. The men on board began to sense that this was no ordinary storm. Many ships were now essentially running blind in a maelstrom of mounting waves and gale-force winds. In the pre-dawn hours of December 18th, 1944, conditions went from bad to worse. Vessels across Task Force 38 recorded steadily falling barometric pressure and wind speeds rising past 40 knots. Driving rain squalls and darkness obscured visibility. Crewmen on carrier flight decks had to crawl on hands and knees to avoid being blown overboard by the howling wind. The barometer on some ships was dropping very rapidly, a classic telltale of an approaching cyclone's eye wall. Still, Without a clear picture of the storm's center, the fleet pushed on. As the Typhoon's full fury closed in, one carrier's radar actually picked up an unusual blip, the curvature of the storm's eye itself, indicating just how close they were to the heart of the tempest. By late morning, Typhoon Cobra was savaging the Third Fleet. Winds of 73 knots, 84 miles per hour, and more were recorded. In fact, some gusts likely exceeded 100 knots, and waves towered as high as 60 to 70 feet, blending sea and sky into a chaos of white spray. Halsey's flagship, the battleship USS New Jersey, struggled to stay on course amid 30 to 40-foot seas. By 1100 hours on the 18th, many vessels had lost formation entirely. Captain Jasper Acuff of the replenishment group later reported that in some ships, the separation of ocean and clouds vanished entirely in the onslaught, a terrifying whiteout of seawater and driving rain. Sailors were ordered to stay off exposed decks as waves crashed over warships' bows and even flight decks. In these conditions, Halsey finally broadcast a fleet-wide typhoon warning at 13:45, the first official acknowledgement of the crisis. But by that time, the storm had already exacted a deadly toll. As Typhoon Cobra raged into the midday of December 18th, it became the worst nightmare of every sailor. The most vulnerable were the destroyers, relatively small warships now caught in monstrous seas with partially empty fuel tanks. Standard practice in heavy weather was to ballast down to add stability, but many destroyer captains had delayed doing so, hoping to refuel at the rendezvous points. Now it was too late. The destroyer USS Spence was among those low on fuel, down to only about 15% of capacity. Her crew belatedly began pumping seawater into her nearly empty fuel tanks, but Spence was already being overwhelmed. Enormous waves pounded her hull, and at around 11:10 a.m., she was blasted by a violent gust. Water poured down her ventilation uptakes and shorted out her electrical systems, knocking out the engines. Without power, Spence lost all headway and lay beam on to the towering waves. Moments later, the ship rolled dangerously to port and never righted herself. The Fletcher-class destroyer capsized and sank, vanishing into the foam. Out of a crew of over 300, only 23 men survived the sinking of Spence. Near the same time, the older destroyer USS Hull was fighting for her life. Hull was a Farragut-class destroyer commissioned in the 1930s and had been refitted with additional armament and radar that made her top-heavy. Despite having about 70% fuel remaining, Hull's high center of gravity left her vulnerable. She struggled in winds over 100 knots, rolling 50 degrees one way, then 70 degrees the other. Captain James Marks and his crew managed to survive those rolls, but around midday, an even more ferocious gust, estimated at 110 knots, struck Hull. The destroyer heeled over past 70 degrees. Seawater rushed into her smokestack and bridge. Overwhelmed, USS Hull capsized in the raging seas. Crew on other ships watched in horror as the hull disappeared. Most of her men went down with the ship. Out of over 200 aboard, only 62 survived to be rescued. USS Monaghan met a similar fate. Monaghan had 76% fuel aboard, more than Spence or Hull, but she too was top-heavy and had been forced to lighten ballast in order to accept fuel during the aborted refueling. As the Typhoon's mountainous waves battered her, Monaghan attempted to ballast further, but some valves stuck, delaying the process. Around 11:30 a.m., Monaghan was hammered by the storm. The ship began taking on severe rolls and then lost both electrical power and steering control. Helpless against the onslaught, the Monaghan foundered and sank, leaving debris and men tossed in the tempest. Out of a crew of roughly 256, only 6 survivors were eventually found alive. Even the larger warships suffered terribly. Escort carriers and fleet carriers, with their broad decks, were slammed by the wind. Planes broke free from their lashings on pitching flight decks and became missiles inside the hangars. A Hellcat fighter or Avenger torpedo bomber, weighing several tons, would snap loose and careen across a hangar bay, smashing into other aircraft or bulkheads. A number of carriers faced dangerous onboard fires as fueled aircraft exploded on impact. The light carrier USS Monterey nearly met a catastrophic end, not from sinking, but from flames. Around 9:11 that morning, Monterey, a 11,000-ton carrier, was rocked by a chain reaction below decks. Several planes broke free and collided, igniting gasoline fires in the hangar. As the hangar inferno spread, smoke poured into the engine rooms, choking off the boilers and causing the ship to lose propulsion. A Monterey junior officer, Lieutenant Gerald R. Ford, the future US president, was serving as officer of the deck. Ford nearly got swept overboard himself as the carrier heeled over 20 degrees and more while he made his way to report on the fire. Directed by Captain Stuart Ingersoll, Lieutenant Ford navigated the smoke-filled passageways to assess the blaze and then reported back up to the bridge on its status. Monterey's crew fought back the conflagration with everything they had. Firefighting teams, some led by Ford and other officers, battled the blaze for 40 minutes in suffocating heat. By 9:45, they managed to contain the fire before it could consume the ship. Monterey was saved, but she was severely damaged and left dead in the water until her engineers could clear the smoke from the boilers. The carrier had lost 18 aircraft to fire and overboard losses, with another 16 wrecked, and suffered multiple casualties. 3 of Monterey's crew were killed, and nearly 40 injured in that blaze. Elsewhere, the carrier USS Cowpens CVL-25 was also hit by a loose, flaming aircraft, but her crew doused the flames quickly. USS Langley CVL-27 rolled up to 70 degrees in the waves, nearly capsizing, while USS San Jacinto CVL-30 had 7 planes break loose in her hangar, wreaking havoc before they could be secured. Across the task force, 146 aircraft were wrecked or blown overboard by the time the Typhoon relented. By the afternoon of December 18th, Typhoon Cobra had scattered Halsey's powerful fleet over a 50 to 60 mile area. Ships that could still navigate were struggling to reconnect with each other. Slowly, the furious winds and seas began to subside. For many crewmen, the end of the storm brought a grim realization. Multiple ships had vanished. Destroyers signaled queries that went unanswered in the spray. Life jackets, rafts, and debris bobbed in the water where proud warships had been. It was only when the weather cleared enough for survivors to be spotted in the ocean that the scale of the disaster became evident. When Typhoon Cobra finally passed, Admiral Halsey directed all available ships to search for men overboard and survivors from the lost destroyers. What followed were desperate rescue efforts in the still rough seas. Many sailors had been adrift for hours, clinging to floater nets, life rafts, or simply bobbing in life vests among the wreckage. One unlikely hero of the rescue operation was the destroyer escort USS Tabora DE-418, a small ship that had herself been badly damaged. She lost her foremast and radio antennas to the storm. Tabora, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Henry Lee Plage, defied the odds and defied orders in the name of saving lives. On the night of the 18th, while the typhoon still raged, Tabora had accidentally come upon a single sailor clinging to wreckage, a survivor of Hull. Realizing men were in the water, Plage ignored the general order for all ships to proceed to port and began a systematic search pattern in the debris-strewn ocean. For the next 51 hours, Tabora's crew painstakingly combed through the area, even as their ship rolled sickeningly. Thanks to their determination, Tabora rescued 55 survivors, men from Hull, Spence, and Monaghan, who otherwise might have never been found. Other ships picked up additional survivors once the weather cleared, and in total, 93 sailors were rescued of the over 800 who had been cast into the sea from the 3 sunken destroyers. For his ship's extraordinary, life-saving efforts, LCDR Plage was later awarded the Legion of Merit by Halsey, and Tabora's crew received the Navy Unit Commendation, the first ever awarded, honouring their bravery and initiative. On December 19th, Halsey brought the battered Third Fleet into the anchorage at Ulithi Atoll, a rear base, as soon as it was safe to do so. It was not until roughly 2 a.m. on December 19th that Halsey himself learned definitively what signals and reports had hinted. 3 destroyers were lost with almost all hands. The news was devastating. In the storm's aftermath, the fleet had just suffered one of the US Navy's worst disasters, delivered by Mother Nature herself. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the Pacific Fleet commander, stated that the Typhoon's impact represented a more crippling blow to the Third Fleet than it might be expected to suffer in anything less than a major action. The toll was staggering. 790 American sailors were dead or missing as a result of the typhoon. 3 destroyers had been sunk outright, while 27 other ships, including battleships, cruisers, and carriers, had sustained storm damage. 11 ships were damaged so badly they had to be sent back to port for major repairs. Dozens of naval aircraft were lost or destroyed. It was, by any measure, the US Navy's worst loss to weather in its history. The calamity demanded a formal accounting. Even though the United States was in the middle of a war, the Navy took the unprecedented step of convening a court of inquiry to investigate the disaster while memories were fresh. In early January 1945, aboard the repair ship USS Cascade at Ulithi, a panel of admirals, with Admiral Nimitz himself in attendance, questioned Halsey and his staff on their decisions leading up to the typhoon. The court's findings, delivered in February 1945, did not recommend harsh discipline, but they did not let Halsey off the hook either. The board concluded that Admiral Halsey had committed an error of judgment in sailing the Third Fleet into the heart of the typhoon. At the same time, they tempered this critique by noting the pressures of wartime operations. Halsey's choices, they said, were errors in judgment committed under the stress of war operations and stemming from a commendable desire to meet military requirements. In other words, he had pushed to refuel and keep stationed to support the troops, but misjudged the risk, a costly mistake, but one made in the zeal of combat. Thus, the Navy stopped short of formally censuring or punishing Halsey. He was, however, quietly removed from operational command for a period. In January 1945, Halsey transferred leadership of the fleet to Admiral Raymond Spruance, though Halsey would later resume command in the final stages of the war. The inquiry also identified others' mistakes. Notably, it faulted the commanding officers of Spence, Hull, and Monaghan for waiting too long to take preventive action, such as ballasting down and slowing to ride out the storm. This delay, the court suggested, contributed to the ship's losses when the full brunt of the typhoon struck. It was a hard pill, acknowledging that some of the lost crew's own decisions may have sealed their fates, but the intent was to learn and prevent such tragedies going forward. Typhoon Cobra's legacy spurred the Navy to improve training, procedures, and weather forecasting. The ordeal prompted new rules for ship stability in storms, revised destroyer design to reduce top heaviness, and encouraged dispersing fleets to evade major storms rather than risk formation in extreme weather. Most significantly, Typhoon Cobra exposed deficiencies in meteorological intelligence. The fact that a typhoon had caught the Third Fleet by surprise was unacceptable to Navy leadership. In response, the Navy dramatically overhauled its weather tracking network in the Pacific. They established more frequent weather reconnaissance flights and deployed weather ships to remote ocean areas to report conditions in real time. By mid-1945, a new Fleet Weather Central was operating out of Guam to provide closer and timelier support to fleets at sea. These improvements were put to the test almost immediately. In June 1945, 6 months after Cobra, another powerful typhoon, Typhoon Connie, struck the US fleet off Okinawa. This time, forewarned by improved tracking, commanders took evasive action, although that storm still inflicted damage on several ships. Though Typhoon Cobra was a catastrophe, it did not alter the course of the Pacific War. The US Navy recovered, repaired its ships, and sailed back into action. But for the men who lived through it, and for the Navy, the storm was a sobering reminder that the sea can be as lethal as any enemy. It remains the worst natural disaster in US Navy history. The Third Fleet's ordeal in Typhoon Cobra ultimately resulted in a smarter, more weather-wise Navy. The tragedy forged improvements that have since saved countless lives, ensuring that such a surprise blow to a fleet should never happen again. Typhoon Cobra was a lesson paid for in blood, but it taught the Navy that even in the absence of enemy action, vigilance and respect for nature's power are absolutely paramount.